Today we'll be talking about Chapter 3, Section 2, and once more the big idea is how political principles and major events shape how people form governments. Because what we need to realize is you got to put that document in context. The Constitution's wonderful. It's no accident that it came about in 1789. Ironically, around the same time that the French Revolution was occurring. So our founding fathers are heatedly debating the essence of federalism while the French Parisians are storming the Bastille and ripping soldiers' body parts off and tossing them around the crowd. I mean, it's crazy to think of what's going on at the same time in different parts of the world. So some of the concepts that we'll see, we'll get to the Electoral College, we'll get to the Federalist, the Anti-Federalist, and lots of stuff to unpack for you. So a few terms that we'll just kind of operate off of, like process and despite. But the trick and the trouble, like a lot of you guys mentioned, is when we're dealing with a subject that people are passionate about. Compromise is difficult. When we're dealing with a lot of people, there has to be a lot of compromise. The fewer the people, the greater the freedom. The bigger the representation, the greater the compromise. Because with the diversity of opinions, you've got to incorporate those as best you can into a simple document, which is not simple. And so, as the American leaders form this new government, Congress asked each state, so this is the Articles of Confederation, the Confederation Congress, they realized it was a failure, and so they came together, each state sent delegates to try to figure out a better solution. You know, the first time they tried to tax people, farmers were burning villages and seizing federal buildings. This is not good. If they can't tax people, they can't be a government. If they can't be a government, then what are we? And so Congress asked each state to send representatives to Philadelphia, which was the operating capital at the time, to fix the problems within the Articles of Confederation. This began in 1787. It took approximately 2 years to the details. So who were these delegates? There were 55 of them in total. A couple notables. Ben Franklin was there. George Washington, James Madison, both future presidents were there. There were some notables not in attendance. For example, Thomas Jefferson was in Paris. He was closely allied with Paris, and they were undergoing some rather significant political troubles. I mean, the king's about to get his head cut off, so he's over there as a diplomat trying to help sort things. John Adams was in London. Most of the Federalists were closely allied with Britain, and so he had close ties to London. Patrick Henry, remember the give me liberty, give me death guy, he just hated the whole idea. When he meant liberty, he wasn't talking about some kind of balance of power between state and federal. He just meant, no, get away from me, government. I'm going to go over here and farm. Yeah, just stay off my land. That was Patrick Henry. Now, there are some very important decisions that were made by these people. George Washington presided over this. Most paintings of American history classes, generally have some painting somewhere. I used to have one forever of Washington presiding over this. If you go to the Capitol, you'll see it. Each state got one vote, and they decided to keep it simple this time. A simple majority would decide any given issue. All this work was kept secret. Because just like we were talking about, if we open up this dialogue to more people, everybody has an opinion. Think of Parks and Rec. Every time they hold a town hall meeting, yes, there's always the idiot with the question. Yeah, these guys, the 55 delegates, were trying to keep the idiots with the questions out of the room. The fewer the people, the fewer the questions, and the quicker this can go. Now, in the end, this was called the Constitutional Convention because this was a meeting of state delegates And the ultimate purpose was to create a constitution. That is, a working framework for this group. Our student government has a constitution. If you've never seen it, it's on our school's website, I think. And when I first created it, I passed it around. I had a time for objections, for comment. I opened it up for public dialogue. When we were all good with it, we signed it. And then it's done. I need to do that again because every few years it needs to be revised because it's a living document. And that's how constitutions work. Now, they decided for a simple majority, possibly just because it made the process easier. The Constitution cannot be easily changed because it takes a 2/3 majority of Congress to change the Constitution, meaning it takes not just a majority of the states, it takes a supermajority. It makes it difficult to change. And so perhaps to streamline it, they just chose the simple majority. Now, what did it look like? It was the result of a series of major compromises. Now, these debates went on for 2 years, and you can read about the proceedings if you choose to later, but I'm going to keep it simple and summarize. A couple of the big compromises. Number one, the Virginia Plan. This called for a government very similar to the one we have today with a 2-house Congress, representation in the 2 houses would be based on each state's population. So a bicameral legislature, a House and a Senate. But the key difference between the Virginia Plan and today's system is they wanted both houses to be based on the state's representation and would be reapportioned every 10 years according to the census, which is how our U.S. House of Representatives works. You know, if North Carolina's population doubles in the next 10 years, then we will get more representatives in Congress at the next Senate, and they will be taken from some other state whose population has shrunk. Obviously, we have a different plan. That's how part of our Congress works. But you see, the Virginia Plan was incorporated with the New Jersey Plan. The New Jersey Plan called for a 1-house legislature. This is the opposite extreme. Each state would get 1 vote, no matter how big or small they were. The small states loved this idea, obviously, because it effectively gave them more power. States didn't like this, for good reason. And so the Great Compromise was the formal agreement proposing a dual system of congressional representation. So we have both. North Carolina has 2 senators. Montana, a state as big as some countries, has 2 senators. Alaska, bigger than the entire southeastern United States, 2 senators. It's crazy, right? Meanwhile, in the U.S. House of Representatives, California has like 30-something representatives. We've got, I can't remember, 9, somewhere around there, maybe 12, depends on the year. And so the Great Compromise provided for this bicameral legislature. This means that states would have equal representation in the House based on population. And then states would have 2 votes per state in the Senate. And that for any law to be passed, it would have to pass both houses, that is, the House and the Senate, and then it would have to go to the president's desk for signature, or if he vetoes it, then they have to override the veto. So it's known as the Great Compromise. That's a big part of it. You guys were asking about the 3/5 compromise. This was an agreement providing that slaves would count as 3/5 of a person in determining representation in Congress. And you're absolutely right that it's a dehumanizing view of human beings. But that's not how Virginia was concerned with it. Virginia wanted the 3/5 compromise because they wanted their slaves to count in regards to population because they wanted more congressmen. Ergo, more power in passing laws. Virginia and Georgia and South Carolina and North Carolina didn't want slavery to end. And even in the framing of the Constitution, they pushed for the right to maintain legislative power to preserve their system of slavery. And that's the 3/5 compromise. Meanwhile, Congress would have the authority to regulate trade between states. Ironically, this is something the Articles of Confederation did not provide for. But interstate commerce regulation is one of the fundamental roles of the United States government. In the Constitution, or in the Constitutional Convention, it was agreed that the United States would not interfere whatsoever in the slave trade until 1808. It would be revisited. Now, the slave trade was abolished decades before the 13th Amendment was passed, because that is the Portuguese slave traders that would bring the boats over and hold auctions for slaves. That was viewed as distasteful even before slavery went out of fashion. I also want to talk about the Electoral College briefly. And I'm sure you guys have some experience with this. The Electoral College are the group of people named by each state legislature to select the president and the vice president. And so you all know in 2016 that 3 million people more voted for the person who lost than the person who won. If you didn't know that, by the way. The sitting president lost the popular vote by 3 million votes. But yet, they won the office of the presidency because of the Electoral College. And so this has led to a lot of questions about what is the Electoral College? Why is this a thing? And then after the election, I Googled it, and there have been other cases of this. Several of them. Perhaps the most famous, well, 16 might be the most famous now, but there have been several other notable cases throughout American history. So, now we got to think about the different views when writing the Constitution. It was not an easy task. For one, to sign off on the Constitution required 2 years worth of going, okay, to House legislature. Is this going to work for you guys? Is this going to work for you guys? Okay, 3/5 compromise. Is this going to work for you guys? Is this going to work for you guys? Okay, I get South Carolina. I get that you're about to start killing people over the slavery thing. I get it. What if we count 3/5 of your slaves as population, and we promise not to touch slavery or even talk about it? Can we live with that? And South Carolina's like, all right, but you touch it. And in all seriousness, it was South Carolina that started the Civil War. It was South Carolina that sent John C. Calhoun that came up with the nullification theory, blah, 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 blah. And you had a whole course about that. And various factions interpreted the Constitution very differently. For example, the Federalists were supporters of the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton was a big believer in the Constitution. He said, look, there needs to be an effective balance of power between the states and the federal government, but we still need an operating national government with real legitimate power. Otherwise, we can't call ourselves a country. Because what happens when one state does something bad to another state? Because it will happen. And it has. And not just once, but many times. Where representatives from one state have done something bad to representatives from a different state. Oh yeah, multiple times. Somebody's got to step in and resolve those disagreements. Ergo, Hamilton's argument was we need an effective national government or we don't have a government at all. And so Federalists supported dividing this power between states and federal governments, which is where we get the 10th Amendment, the catch-all that if we didn't say it in the U.S. Constitution, it's up to the states. And so they support the Constitution as it was written. Well, here's the thing. The original draft of the Constitution did not include the Bill of Rights. Honestly, the Federalists just kind of assumed, well, okay, we'll just assume that people have those rights. It's common sense, right? Well, the Anti-Federalists weren't that trusting. They were like, no, I want it in formal writing on the formal charter of our country that I can call you a doo-doo head if I want to. That my free speech allows me to criticize you if I don't like what you're doing. Because, of course, next you have the Anti-Federalists. And these were those who opposed the ratification of the Constitution. These were the famous holdouts. And like some of you said, represented significant chunks of this country. Wound up forming the first opposition political party. When Washington ran, there was one party, the Federalist. But it didn't take long for Jefferson to found his own party. And so the Anti-Federalists were famous holdouts. They opposed and distrusted any type of central or national government. They believed it gave too much power to the national government and took away too much power from the states. It's ironic, though, because our government today is so much larger and more complex than it was at the time of the founding of the Constitution. Do you know that when Jefferson took office as our third president, he eliminated taxes? He was able to run the entire United States government off of sales taxes from international trade. It's insane. And here we are. I paid a tax to drive my car here this morning. A wheel tax. I paid a tax to fill up my car with gas the other day. I paid a tax to exist in my house, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas Jefferson, that's just, we're talking about the size of the government. And so imagine what type of heart attack the Anti-Federalists would have today. In terms of thinking about the size and power of our national government. Even though today one party thinks of themselves as the little government party, one party thinks of themselves as the big party. What are we even talking about? Because we're never going back to no taxes. Just forget about it. So, what do we even mean by small government anymore? But they did want a Bill of Rights, and that's kind of the famous compromise that occurred from this debate. They wanted that amendment that says if we didn't think of it, it doesn't mean it still exists. In legal terms, we'll learn when we get to the law portion of this course, it doesn't mean there's such a thing as an ex post facto law. If you've ever had your parents say, I know I didn't tell you this, but you still shouldn't do it. In our country, that's illegal. And that's what the 10th Amendment is all about. If we didn't say it, if we haven't added it yet to the Constitution, live your life. Okay, so the Bill of Rights. Yeah, the Bill of Rights were added, obviously, and we'll learn about those details on a later date. The Constitution was ratified. Thank goodness we can have a country.
Amen.
Yay.
Yeah.
Yay with a question mark. Okay. Do we need a strong national government?